Hey everybody, hello. I thought this would happen. I'm doing a second book review, part two of my book review of How the World Thinks by Julian Baggini. That way or that way? I don't know. I know this camera flips things. There's a lot in this book, and the first review I did, I think it was 10 minutes? I don't know, maybe more, which seems a bit long to me. But there's a lot of things mentioned in here that I didn't cover in the first one. But one of the things that came to me straight after I did the review, and I thought, oh, I should have talked a bit more about that, was the difference between not Eastern and Western philosophies, but Eastern and Western philosophers. So people like Nietzsche, people like Aristotle, of course, is the most famous one, and all of the big Western philosophers didn't have families. In fact, Nietzsche once said that as soon as you've had a child, it's like having a ball and chain. The shackles are made for you. They weren't into family. The ones who did have children basically just, they would just have a child, bugger off, have a child, bugger off, don't give a damn about raising the family. Um, and none of them, even I think it was David Hume, who said that a serious philosopher can't have a family because he has to give all his effort towards philosophy. Now, you could admire that, saying, oh, so devoted to the craft, or you could just think, what a bunch of sods, you know. Um, but you'd have to read, to be fair, all of their biographies, you know. But then you look at the Eastern philosophers. The Eastern philosophers had families, you know, and in Eastern philosophy, everything is relational. So hierarchies are very important. The whole idea of Confucianism is hierarchical, and in relation, when I say relational, it gives rules. It gives dictates, how one should behave towards a younger person, or towards a parent, or towards a father or a mother, or towards a brother, and the children should be filial. They should care for their parents. They should look after their parents. An older brother should look after his younger brother. A younger brother should be. All of these things really mattered in Eastern philosophy, and there's a lot to be said, I think, about Eastern family values over the whole push towards individualism. You know, Thatcher famously said, "There's no such thing as society, right? Just individuals." That's really an expression of the whole Western, or part of the whole Western philosophical idea of individualism. And what's also very interesting is thousands of miles apart at about the same time, Eastern and Western philosophies come up with the same similar ideas, which are really just about trying to be the best person you can be. So one was in Chinese philosophy, you had Confucius, um, and then at about the same time, I can't remember who was in the West. Was it Aristotle? But the timing seemed wrong. So these are interesting. Then going back to the Anglicization of famous philosophers who weren't Western, you can't possibly have somebody who's good at philosophy who doesn't sound white, right? Um, Avicenna. Avicenna was not Avicenna. Of course, he wasn't bloody Avicenna. He was Ibn Sena. He was a Muslim. He was an Arab or a Persian or an Iranian. Of course, Iranians now are meant to think they're all evil monsters who bomb hospitals. Oh, I know someone who bombs hospitals. Yeah, it's all bullshit. It's all propaganda. But it's a really interesting book. A really fascinating book. The other thing I didn't really talk about was how philosophy can possibly be harmful as well as helpful, which makes a lot of sense because philosophy is a way of thinking, and if you've got a crappy way of thinking, that can lead to depression, that can lead to self-destruction. People who commit suicide have very unhelpful ways of thinking, right? So obviously you've got to keep that in mind. But I remember there's a passage in there when Julian's talking about traveling to India, and he's talking about Indian philosophy there as well. And he says one of the things that became very clear to him was just the extreme poverty in so much of India. You've got a rich and you've got a poor, which is really the great aim of neoliberalism. So we might be headed there, right? Um, but everybody else, uh, you know, there's so much poverty. And he said he'd been to just as many, several places in East Africa which were just as poor, but none that was so desperate or dirty or filthy. And then he said there's an argument for the idea that the 330 or 360 million gods or whatever that some parts of the Hindu tradition are meant to believe in. kind of give people an excuse for despondency. Everything's a God, so what power do we have? That's one point he raised in there, which I thought was really, really interesting. You know, your philosophy, whether that comes from religion, and really, most old philosophy does come from religion. Religions are just philosophies that took hold, and then many of them, of course, anything that disagreed with them, they just battered down violently. Um, so dogma in religion, dogma in any belief system, philosophy, religion can be quite dangerous. The other thing he mentions in there is Russian philosophy. There seems to be an enormous lack of it. It's something he'd like to study more and he'd like to get to know more. I'd certainly like to get to know more of it as well. And then in the Indian philosophies and the religions, you've got nirvana, which is essentially death. It's a release from the cycle of birth and rebirth. Um, and that's what's coming back to me at the moment. I'll probably think of more stuff I want to say about this book, but I thought there were important ones to point out. Here's an interesting one. Now, this just popped into my head, and it popped into my head originally while I was reading this, which is probably going to get me in trouble with people. But you know, if we can't openly discuss our ideas, then that sucks. The whole idea of um, the whole idea of family is very important. So, in Eastern religions and Eastern belief systems, and no, I don't even want to go there. I don't even want to say what I'm going to say with this because it's too controversial to be said out of context and out of a much longer discussion, a more detailed discussion. Yeah, I'm going to say it anyway, right? So, in the Catholic Church, where people are expected to be celibate, where families don't matter, and it's lost that. And I say the Catholic Church not because I've got anything against the church or religions, but just because in the Catholic Church, which was in Europe, where philosophy was very much individualistic and family didn't matter, you know, so the priests weren't meant to have children, you got a lot of abuse, you got a lot of sexual abuse. Whereas, would that have been avoidable in belief systems where there wasn't a need for celibacy or anything like that? I don't know. But that just goes back to the point that what you believe in is you've got to be careful because it can be dangerous. It can lead to bad consequences. You know, if you've got an extreme belief system that kind of goes against human nature, that's going to create problems, I think. And now I've probably gone too far with this review. That was just meant to be a catch up on the last review, but that doesn't detract from the book. It's just my perverted mind. Okay, I apologize. It's a really good book, and you should probably read it. All right. Make your own conclusions. How the World Thinks, Julian Baggini.